Hello everybody and welcome back to the Ultimate Fashion History with me, Amanda Hallay, for an episode in our little series running on the channel called History in Colour, where we look back at the palettes and favoured colour waves of a particular decade or era in history, try to analyse why people were so drawn to the colours that they were, and then look at how it all applies to fashion. And I am so excited about this episode because we are doing the 1950s through to the early 1960s, mid-century modern colour. My favourite. Oh, this is going to be epic. I'm so excited. But before we start, just to remind you all that I don't do comments here on YouTube because if you have a fashion channel, all you get is spam. But you can write to me directly through my website, amandahallay.com. And if you want to comment publicly and start a bit of a chat, you can do so on Facebook. And you can always subscribe to the channel at any point during this episode just by clicking that little circle down there. Also, I just want to say what an enormous debt of gratitude I owe to a couple of books recently acquired that have helped me so much in this series on colour. The first is Chromatopia by David Coles, which is absolutely beautiful and goes back to discuss the discovery and application of pigment. And this will come in really useful when I do history of colour episodes on more historic, even ancient eras. And also this book, simply called Colour by Alexandra Losk, which is fabulous and really puts colour into historical context. Anyway, I learned a lot about the technical side of colour from both of these extraordinary books, and I recommend both of them highly. And I just want to throw a little qualifier in here. In this episode on the atomic age, I will be talking about gender. And I'll be talking about gender in a historical context and discussing traditional perceptions of gender and gender roles in the 50s and early 1960s. I just don't want any of you to think that I personally believe that women are instinctively drawn to pinks and pastels or that men prefer somber colours. So please take everything in the historical context it's intended. And I also want to say that, as you all know, all colours existed at all times, so please don't write in and say, "What are you talking about, Hallay? I had a red dress in the 80s," or "I had pink walls in the 70s," because what I try to do in this series is to isolate the colours and colour waves that were particularly popular in any given era and theorise as to why they may have been so popular. Which brings me to this. Okay, I'm calling this episode of History in Colour the 1950s, but I'm only doing so because I already titled other episodes in the series by decade. In fact, this episode is on the palette throughout the mid-century. But more specifically, let's take it from circa 1950 to November 22nd, 1963, the date of Kennedy's assassination, which is when I think this era sort of ended and moved into the high 1960s. So we're talking about the mid-century, the atomic age, and then the Kennedy era. Now, of course, this is the ultimate fashion history, but I'm not going to talk so much about fashion in the 50s and early 60s. There's a lot of episodes on this era, on the 50s, on the new look, and then, of course, the 1960s. But in this series, I really want to keep the focus on colour and why that atomic age palette might have happened the way that it did. Because, as we all know, you've heard this a million times, my catchphrase is fashion is not an island, it's a response. But you know what? I truly believe that palette is not an island either. It's a response to what was happening in the world and the way that people feel and felt about what's happening in the world. So let's just remind ourselves of what was happening at this point in the 20th century. Certainly, World War II had ended, to be replaced almost instantly by the Cold War and the very real threat of nuclear war that gave rise to that duck-and-cover culture of the American mid-century and the fear of communism both at home and abroad, as evidenced in the Korean War. Now, all of this sounds pretty dismal, and yet this was also an era of tremendous optimism, of that American dream coming true, along with dreams of the future that became incredible realities. A line was really drawn in the sand at the end of World War II, and the atomic age was an era of new and improved everything. New shapes, new cars, new architectures, new horizons to explore, be they the top of Everest or outer space. There was a new queen on the British throne, and in fashion, of course, we had the new look. And colours had to be new as well. And I feel we got our first true glimpse of what the mid-century palette would look like, not in America, interestingly, but in post-war England. The Festival of Britain in 1951, which was created to boost morale in the still ration nation to promote British science and design, was a festival of colour, bright primary and secondary colours, and these playful, colourful brights were applied from everything, from textiles to furniture. Like with these famous antelope chairs designed by Ernest Race, which really caused a mild sensation. Furniture was traditionally worked in practical and enduring browns and greys and forgiving shades of green. Suddenly, furniture was bright, lively, fun, and particularly cheering in the post-war landscape. In the United States, the GI Bill saw the spread of suburbia, the creation of affordable, open-plan homes like the iconic mid-century ranch-style house, demanding a fresh new palette in keeping with this fresh new architecture. This was perceived as the American dream come true. Families huddled round their brand new television sets, the future looking bright, as life became lifestyle, and this lifestyle was meant to put all thoughts of war and deprivation behind it, and it needed a palette that would correspond to the sense of cheerful optimism. Colour was really starting to matter, and in the USA it would become a mid-century obsession. But before we look at the palettes and the colour combinations that mark the era, let's look at colour in the 50s on a broader socio-economic, cultural and scientific landscape. This was the age of consumerism, right? And television was the ideal platform for selling this American dream. From cars to refrigerators to furniture, the supply was seemingly as endless as the demand. But how do you sell even more of your product? By producing your product in lots of different colours, be it an Eames chair, and of course this new wave of furniture design made of affordable fiberglass and plastics lent itself perfectly to this explosion of colour, to refrigerator door handles, to the fridge itself, to toilet paper. Look at all those different shades of toilet paper. Why is toilet paper only white today? To telephones. This era was one where not only colour was important, but colour choices were important, and naturally these endless colour options would be applied instantly to fashion. I think you're beginning to get the idea that colour really mattered in the 50s. Even food got colourful. Look at these candies. I wish they still made them. And look at this Jell-O salad. I cannot imagine this would ever have appealed to anyone. But if it did, it was surely because of the colour. No wonder this is the era when we first met Peeps. And all of this makes perfect sense when we remember that colour itself was such a hot topic in this era. Villalobos had just published the Colour Atlas in 1947, that seminal work, just in time for the mid-century colour obsession. And throughout the 1950s, Robert F. Wilson wrote about the psychological impact of colour in schools, home, and in industry, demonstrating how colour can really make a difference in productivity and happiness. Now, we all know that the mid-century was the golden age of commercial illustration, with artists like Kobe Whitmore, Jack Potter, and my favourite Bob Peak selling this new American dream with their colourful depictions of America at play and at travel. And indeed, it was the printing industry itself that would give colour in this era its biggest boost. In 1956, New York printing company M&J Levine hired a recent graduate, Lawrence Herbert, as a part-time employee to somehow standardize their pigments and the resulting colors. Herbert had just graduated in chemistry. Now, of course, there had been attempts to have a universal colour standard, but because there wasn't one to draw upon in the first place, this never really worked. The result was that even if two images were identical in print, the colours would appear very differently. Herbert used his knowledge in chemistry to standardize colours at M&J Levine so that ultimately print colours read true to their original. His work was so revolutionary that before long the colour division of M&J Printing was earning considerably more than the advertising division, and in 1962 Lawrence Herbert bought the company himself, made it solely about the international standardization of colour, and as you already guessed, he renamed this company Pantone. And the key thing about the standardization of colour in the 50s is that, for example, the colour of a Dior gown in a salon in Paris could be duplicated pretty accurately by Sears Roebuck or McCall's, for example. A colour standard basically made it easier to communicate colour far more easily and far more accurately than ever before. There were also enormous advances in paint itself, and they came at just the right time, right, with that spread of suburbia and the necessity to paint all of these new homes. Now, prior to the 1950s, house paint came in a finite number of colours that were stocked in store, and in any given season there might be 30 or 40 shades to choose from. In the mid-century, however, the technology that we still use today, unlimited colours available via the in-store mixing of pigments with white paint, became available, and people went from having a couple dozen options for their living room to having 1,322 colours to choose from. It must have been mind-blowing, and of course it all tied in perfectly with that mid-century love of all things scientific. These pigment mixing systems given space-age names like colorizer and spectrorama. However, this enormous choice of new colours made people feel somewhat insecure. There was suddenly so much to choose from that people could become overwhelmed, sort of the way I feel at a good Las Vegas buffet. And so a satellite industry developed that taught people all about colour and how to make colour work together. Books and magazines taught a populace that had suddenly become overwhelmed with colour choices to understand colour, how to decorate with colour, how to mix colours, what colours worked with others, and of course there were systems like this wheel here, which of course tapped into the era's love of gadgetry. And paint manufacturers even produced film tutorials on how to match colour. They're actually really great and delightfully patronising. There's one on YouTube by Colorize. Now, working with colour never challenged people before. There were a zillion colours to choose from. And it seems to me that there was a double-edged sword at play here. With this satellite industry that set out to explain and demystify the mixing and matching of colours, the fact that it told people that they needed to have all of this explained to them must have made them feel incredibly nervous and insecure about their own tastes. Yet this really was the first time that colour was hands-on and do-it-yourself, exemplified perfectly in one of my personal favourite mid-century crazes. Paint by number, the paint-your-own masterpiece concept that found regular Joes and Joesses mixing their own colours from the limited number of colours provided in each kit. Mix 3 drops of number 15 with 2 drops of number 12, and usually it worked out, but not always. Queen Elizabeth's face here almost looks like camo. However, professional artists always got it right. Colour was the big story in the post-war abstract expressionist world. A whole new genre was developed around the concept of colour, with artists like Barnett Newman here, Clifford Still, and of course Mark Rothko dubbed colour field painters. And it was also the era of Calder and his colourful mobiles and bright primary tones. So I think I've made my case that colour was a pretty big deal in the mid-century era. For goodness sake, people even dyed their poodles. Colour always tells a story, but in the post-war world, colour was used to change the story. From one of muted utility to that of cheerful optimism, colour was everywhere, but not as it was in the colourful 1980s, which was a cacophony of colour, as discussed in my episode of History in Colour on the 1980s. In the mid-century, none of the palettes competed. They worked together in a surprisingly unifying harmony. So now that we've established just how important colour actually was in the 50s and early 60s, let's break down the main colour waves and theorize as to why these particular colours and the pairing of these particular colours was so popular. Of course, I can't include them all, there were so many, but I think I've isolated what I at least think were the main colour stories of the 50s and early 60s, and I've given each a title. The first one I want to talk about I've titled Optimistic and Saturated Pastels. Not the light pastels we find in the 80s, but more saturated pastels. Corals, seafoam, turquoise, sunflower yellow, and these pastels were applied to everything, from industrial design, to fashion, to furniture, to cars, to signage. These saturated pastels were so often the palette of these modern new homes, and just looking at wall paint swatches from the era, we can really see just how this palette dominated everything. And to my mind, the signature colour combo of the era was the teaming of pinks and corals with either teal or seafoam. We see this an awful lot in the atomic age, and it's one of my favourite colour couplings. The post-war expressionists had been working in pastels anyway, people like Rothko and Frankenthaler, so pastels weren't only optimistic and cheerful, they were also considered rather trendy. This pastel palette dominated the 50s and was applied to absolutely everything, from appliances to homeware, to packaging, to food. Look at how pastel-toned the packets for these TV dinners are. Well, sure, these were happy, optimistic colours, but I think it goes a bit deeper than that. Why were pastels so popular? Well, this was the age of consumerism, right? This was the era of sell, 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 and buy, 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 and who did all the shopping in the mid-century household? Who made the decisions about decorating the home? What sort of homeware to buy? What sort of food to buy? Basically, who held the purse strings and who spent the money? Well, of course, women. Now, we've all been fed this idea of the little mid-century housewife returning to the role of wife and mother after working through the war years. You know, all those memes that go around that humorously highlight the sexism of the era. And yes, to a certain extent, all of this is true. Yet, while many like to think of the 1950s housewife as being nothing more than a wife and mother and serving her husband and baking cakes, she did a hell of a lot more than that. Certainly, she did all the household grocery shopping, but she also made the decisions as to interior design. She bought the bedding and the curtains. She bought the homeware. She bought the toilet paper. She bought everything that was needed for the home, and so it's no surprise that everything was manufactured and marketed to the female consumer. And traditionally, and remember, I'm speaking not only historically, but to this specific period of history, people thought that women warmed towards pretty pastel colours. Now, of course, I am generalising here. Many men were as active in the decisions on how a home should look as their wives, but the term homemaker really meant more than wife and mother. It covered everything from making curtains to making decisions, and big ones, about every aspect of interior living. In the post-war era, as I said, life became lifestyle, and it was women who styled it, and products for the home were aimed directly at her. I mean, it's a no-brainer that Ralph's grocery store in California used pastels in its architectural design, but this also explains why feminine colors were often used in advertising for products that traditionally had a greater number of male end consumers. Hubby may have drunk the beer, but it was his wife who would have bought it. So let's get her attention with a nice pink ad. That understood, men were very comfortable and happy surrounded by feminine pastels. War, after all, is dark and dirty with lots of khaki, and these happy pastels signified peace and prosperity. And of course, pastel palettes were ubiquitous in fashion, marrying themselves perfectly to the re-feminization that came with Dior's new look and all of its imitators. And it was particularly lovely when all of these shades were worked together. These saturated pastels would be a mainstay of fashion's palette throughout the period we're looking at. And let's not forget that Mrs. Kennedy was wearing a saturated pale pink suit on the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Sometimes these pastels would take on a frosted tone. Think about all of the frosted homeware we find in the Atomic Age. And when applied to fashion, it really did evoke the Ice Maiden, that cool, sophisticated ideal of the mid-century fashion landscape. Even Cinderella's original ball gown was a frosted pastel, and I talk more about the colour of that dress in an episode of that dress here on the Ultimate Fashion History. On a personal note, this colour wave is my personal favourite. Here are some of my personal effects, and you can see how much I love these mid-century pastels. My favourite fashion colour combo is seafoam and coral, and when I painted the grey lawn furniture, I had to do it in this mid-century combo of turquoise and pink. And speaking of the latter colour, before we leave this colour wave and move on to the next, you are all fashion history people, and you will never forgive me if I don't invite us all to Think Pink. Sung about in funny face, I think that the popularity of pink in the mid-century was due to the double forces of the re-embrace of femininity coupled with the end of war. Pink is the traditional signature colour of the female, right? And pink is also the least likely colour to associate with war, and boy did we see a lot of pink in the mid-century. It was everywhere, and not just on stuff we'd associate with females. Look at this pink ad for some sort of industrial product. Pink on this Stan Getz album cover. There's Elvis in a pink jacket and a pink shirt. Harry Belafonte in a pink shirt. Old Blue Eyes in a pink shirt. Look, this is the cover to a hard-boiled detective thriller. It's pink. The Coming of Conan, that's not a very feminine book. Pink. The Bad Seed, a scary thriller. The cover is in pink. And let's look at some pink food. And so it's no surprise to see pink applied to interiors so often. And it is obvious that in the ultra-feminized fashion landscape of the era, pink would be a dominant color. It really was a girl's best friend. It was seen on every level of fashion and lent itself perfectly, of course, to the emerging junior wear market. And pink was a big colour in fashion all the way through to the early 60s, to be replaced a little bit later with the British invasion and the big return to primaries. The next colour wave of the mid-century I've isolated for discussion I am calling Technicolor. As you know, there were enormous advances in film colour in the post-war era, all of it way too technical to talk about here, because to be honest, some of it is just way too technical for me to fully understand. Although colour TV was introduced as early as 1950, the majority of sets still functioned only in black and white, and so Hollywood threw colour into the competition with TV, producing rich and vibrant tones of blues, greens, yellows and reds, those vibrant and saturated hues we see in the big musicals, and of course the westerns and those Technicolor dramas of Douglas Sirk. And in terms of still photography, think of the sort of vibrancy of colour we find in the work of Slim Aarons or the Kodachrome photography of the 50s and 60s, and advances in colour camera film were equally spectacular in this era. These were deep, rich, exciting tones that said, we've got it made, we're living large, we've made it big, and they lent themselves perfectly to the roadside neon of the era, to jukeboxes, to album covers, book jackets, movie posters, and sometimes even the home. And fashion responded to these cinematic hues: midnight blues, bright yellows, deep greens, and pulsating orange, to name but a few. But I would wager that within this Technicolor palette, the biggest star of all was red. Red was everywhere. Think of Revlon's iconic Fire and Ice campaign. Red could be sultry and sexy. It could be innocent and all-American. It could be sophisticated. But it could also speak to that burgeoning junior wear market. But what I think is rather curious is that red was such a popular colour in the very era when we were so afraid of reds. Keeping with this rich and cinematic colour wave but adding gold, I call my next palette Hollywood Regency. Of course I do. That's what it's called, this particular design movement, along with all of its incumbent colours, these plush, jewelled tones teamed with gold. And I often think it's the pairing of colours as much as the colours themselves that give an era its signature palette, don't you? We tend to forget just how much gold was around during this era, yet gold is a colour and needs to be discussed here. It was especially prevalent in furniture and interior design. Gold teamed with jade, ruby, emerald, sapphire, deep, rich, jewel-like colours that gave an air of instant luxury, the American dream not only coming true but exceeding all expectations. At least that's what the makers of Hollywood Regency furniture would have us believe. And regular viewers of the UFH already know that, yes, when it comes to my personal wardrobe, I favour those mid-century cheerful pastels. Yet when it comes to my living space, I am pure Hollywood Regency all the way. These opulent and luxurious colour pairings were particularly popular in restaurants of the era, making diners feel as if they had stepped into their very own MGM movie. The idea of the American dream achieved, served up with ribeye steak and 3 martinis. And of course, this teaming of sumptuous jewel tones with gold was perfect for fashion. This wonderful dress you see here comes courtesy of Valerie at Quiet West. Hello, Valerie. A fabulous online vintage store that I discovered while researching this episode. I'll leave a link to Quiet West in the description part of this episode. And thank you, Valerie, for allowing me to use this wonderful image of yours. But it's so perfect to describe how Hollywood Regency was also applied to fashion, as it was here in this incredible pagoda suit by Charles James. And take a look at this wiggle dress. I'm calling my next quintessential mid-century colour pairing Daddy-O. Think Beatniks, think primitivism, think the intelligentsia, the avant-garde, the existentials, or at least those who bought into these ideas by moving away from those positive pastels or that royal Hollywood Regency and embraced a more artsy and bohemian spirit. And it really amazed me at just how much black and white and yellow I found when I started piecing all of this together. Think Pollock, think de Kooning, think those expressionist painters, think the covers of existential books like this one by Simone de Beauvoir, all of this black and yellow. Anything of the era that sort of suggested primitivism was often worked in black, yellow, or black, yellow, and white. And I really think that this is a colour pairing that is sort of forgotten, but when you start really digging into artifacts and homeware and textiles from this era, it really is amazing just how much black and white and yellow you come across. And finally, and really just for fun, I'm calling this colour wave of the mid-century. It came from outer space. The space craze of the atomic era gave way to an obsession with science fiction. There were so many B-movies and comic books and pulp novels, the covers and posters taking on these wild and otherworldly colour combinations, heliotrope with mantis green, red and almost neon yellows, these wild combinations that are so instantly recognisable to us now as belonging to then. And did fashion respond? Oh, doesn't it always? Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of History in Colour here on the Ultimate Fashion History. You can contact me through my website, amandahallay.com, and if you want to leave a comment, visit us on Facebook. And subscribe for more. Click that little circle, and I'll be back very soon. So bye for now.